figure. Standing in the water now, just ahead of her, its face obscured by the mist. This time, it was closer. Much closer. A wave of terror crashed over her. This wasn't another hiker. This wasn't anyone at all. It was something else. She turned and ran, if running through chest-high water could even be called that. She pushed forward with every ounce of strength she had left, her legs screaming in protest as she fought the current. She had to make it back to the mouth of the river, back to the sign she had seen earlier. It was her only hope. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic. The figure was gone again, but she knew it was still there, watching, waiting. The water surged around her, pulling her down as the tide rose higher, faster. She had lost track of time, and now the river was swallowing her whole. There, the white sign. She made one final push, her breath ragged, her muscles on fire. The current was too strong, the water pulling at her with an unnatural force, but she couldn't stop now. She stripped off her pack and held it above her head, fighting her way across the river, the weight of the water threatening to drag her under. Finally, she stumbled onto the shore, collapsing onto the wet rocks, her chest heaving. She looked back at the river, its surface calm once more. There was no sign of the figure, no sound, only the steady pull of the tide and the soft whisper of the wind. When she reached the sign, her hands shaking, she saw it. The trail markers were there, but they were painted on rocks now buried beneath the rising water, their symbols obscured by the eelgrass swirling around them like dead fingers reaching for the surface. And then as she reached the shore, she felt it. A hand. Cold, wet, and impossibly strong, it wrapped around her ankle, pulling her back into the river. She screamed, thrashing against the invisible force, but there was nothing there. No figure, no hand, only the icy grip of the water pulling her under. She forced herself to her feet and started running through the thigh-deep water, her body numb with exhaustion, her mind racing. She collapsed on the far shore, trembling and soaked. She looked back at the river, its surface calm once more. There was no sign of the figure, no sound, only the whisper of the wind, and the quiet rush of the tide pulling out to sea. Finally, she made it to the trail, her hands shaking. She pulled off her pack to check her gear, and that's when she saw it. A weathered, half-decayed piece of fabric. A patchwork of what looked like human hair, twisted and knotted together. It was wet, the texture rough and slimy in her hands. She felt bile rise in her throat as she realized this hadn't been in her pack before. The hair seemed ancient, brittle in places, but still holding the strong smell of river water and something metallic, like blood. Her heart hammered as her fingers brushed against something embedded in the fabric. A broken, yellowed tooth, worn and rounded, like it had been passed down through generations. She flung the thing away from her, but the sensation of being watched stayed with her, growing heavier with each step as she climbed the final peak to the access trail. She was soaked from the river in sweat. She was out of water, and it felt like she was crawling by this point. Her mother's voice was a distant comfort, but as she collapsed into the car, tears streaming down her face, she couldn't shake the sense that something had followed her out. Something old, something patient, and it wasn't finished with her yet.